بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. Given the fact that some of the students are out, we're going to begin with an article, inshallah, which is relevant in terms of its framework, which deals with the problem of nationalism in Islam. Now, this topic is being taken up by uh, scholarship and intellectuals in Egypt and in Syria, but there's a particular framework that is here that is brought in by Sheikh al-Marsafi, who was one of the scholars of Al-Azhar al-Sharif. And that framework is very important overall when it comes to the issue of developing Islamic thought. Now, this article, uh, it is being produced within the Indonesian circles. So that's something to keep in mind. And the Indonesians, they are writing in English as well as the Malaysians, not totally in English, but they have materials in English and they deal with much more relevant topics from the angle of scholarship than what we're seeing coming from the West itself, which is very interesting because they allow us to see how it is that other countries are interacting with each other, right? With the way that that population is interacting with the rest of the Muslim world, I should say. Now, Indonesia is one of the largest Muslim populations on the face of the earth, if not the largest, um, in terms of one geographical center. And then we know that the African continent has a significant amount of Muslims. And the reality of the situation is that Islam uh, is not totally centered in the Arab sphere. It is pretty widespread, and not to mention the Muslims in India in uh, and also Pakistan and those regions. You know, the numbers in Asia are quite high, but you find significant amount of Muslims outside of the geography of the Arabic speakers. Now, in the abstract, which is summarizing in brief, it talks about the problem of the relationship between Islam and nationalism and history. So you have an idea, you have an ideology, or you have a certain way of organizing people politically and culturally and ethnically. Then you have Islamic practice. Then you have the reality of history. Like those are the 3 points that we can derive from that. He says that the problem of the relationship between nationalism, Islam, and Islam has historically revealed dynamic discourses. But we're not really discussing this issue much. This problem is important not only in understanding the contemporary, I'm not going to say modern, but the contemporary discourse on Islam nationalism, but also in promoting a dialogue between Islam and the West. Now, one of the reasons why I fixated on this article, as I'm still developing the syllabus, waiting to see if people are going to get the books or not for the study group, is that when it comes, for instance, in the case of Black Muslims, the idea of nationalism is thrown out and automatically is created into a problem. But you don't find that nationalism as it plays out in the Muslim world is discussed in with the same spirit at times. The other issue is that we as a community, overall, the Ummah, I'm saying in this case, we're not necessarily clear on what are the limits of nationalism. And in the case of the Black Muslim community, nationalism doesn't mean the same thing for the most part that you find that it means in other environments. And that's not by my claim. Dr. Oba Tashaka talks about the idea, basically, nationalism is kind of an idea of tribe, Whereas nationalism in other places, it's a political project. And part of the issue, there may have been some that have pushed, like for instance, Malcolm and others, for land within the context of the black struggle. But you find many are not really associating land with the claim, right? And so Dr. Obitashaka puts that as the concept of peoplehood, right? And so some may have the land claim. Some may say that we need to have land. We need to liberate land. And there have been movements within the US that have brought that to the fore. So I want us to think about those things in the background, like what does all of this mean in our context? So he says this paper attempts to show how the best known of Muslim intellectuals from Egypt and Syria during the 19th and the first half of the 20th century managed to fuse Islamic concepts and nationalism together into a single unified discourse. After the fall of the Khilafah, which has been about 100 years now, officially officially disbanded in 1924 by the Turks themselves. And we have to realize that with the dismantling of the Khilafah came a lot of things. There's another paper, actually, it's not a paper, it's a book. And to my surprise, it was translated into English. And it's called Tyranny. It's called Tyranny by Abdurrahman al-Kawkabi. And I wanted to actually introduce it into the circle as a secondary reference. But Abdurrahman al-Kawkabi was writing on the issue of tyranny and liberation. And here sometimes al-istibdad is written off as dictatorship. We can say authoritarian rule. But Abdurrahman al-Kawkabi, interestingly enough, is creating an argument which is not popular among many of the Muslims. You can find more sympathy within the Arabic speaking world for it than in other places. Abdurrahman al-Kawkabi is arguing that the Ottomans were engaging in tyrannical practices. Now, some people see this as being traitorous to the established rulership. But there, when we talk about the issue of liberation, we have to ask these types of questions sometimes that are uncomfortable. Was there was there a way of doing of playing with power in the Muslim world that led to criticisms and and was there suppression of identity? And we know historically that in some cases the Ottomans did enforce their way on others. That doesn't take away from whatever good or legitimacy that they had, but it does raise the question of, the issue of identity and suppression and bring it to the fore. And so topics such as tyranny, injustice, oppression, justice, all of that is coming up. And some of the stuff is taken up by Sheikh al-Marsafi and is brought up in this paper because Sheikh al-Marsafi, he was a linguist. He was a scholar, but he was a linguist. And he saw a linguistic transformation take place. And so he focused on 8 words that were coming into the Arabic language. And those 8 words were words that focused on concepts. Uh, I didn't memorize all of them. All right, let me pull them up. They were focusing on things like freedom, uh, justice, oppression, uh, and other concepts that became popular uh, within the vocabulary of the Arabic speakers. So the 8 words, more specifically and more directly, were ummah, the idea of ummah, or the idea of community, nation, the idea of watan, which is the idea of homeland, al-hukuma, the idea of government, al-adl, or the idea of justice, al-zulm, the idea of oppression and injustice, siyasa, or politics, hurriya, or freedom, and tarbiyah. Al-Marsifi, from my understanding, was arguing that these terms serve as the core of modern nationalism and were borrowed from European political influence, and they became dominant in the consciousness of the Middle East. And there was the historical Rabi revolt in Egypt, right? So uh, this book was written by Al-Marsafi. It was written right before this revolt took place to show that he was culturally aware. He was in touch with what was going on in his time period, and he was realizing that language is a tool that you can begin to weigh how it is that people are thinking and what direction that they're going in. The Jewish Algerian philosopher Derrida, who's a postmodern philosopher, he actually spent majority of his time in France, although he was part of the Muslim world, uh, from Algeria, and although he's Jewish, interestingly enough, he wrote in forget what philosophical treatise it was, already years ago, but he talked about language and how you can talk about the decline of a civilization when you begin to see language usage. And he talked about the usage of like foul words and all of that, how that becomes common, and we see that in today's time. I'm just using that as an example to say that language creates a shift in the mindset. And Malcolm, in part of what I call the transformation cycle, based on Obata works, but Malcolm had an idea that um, Malcolm had this concept that at a certain point, when your philosophy changes, then what will end up changing as well is your language at a certain point, your language. And we know that Malcolm put a lot of emphasis on the study of the dictionary in expanding his linguistic capacity. And so this framework is part of what is embedded here. And so ideas like nationalism, even you can turn it into something like when we talk about tasawwuf or aqidah and this types of thing. Like, what do we mean by that? We shouldn't assume automatically that we know uh, what it is. We shouldn't assume that we know automatically what it is that's being said, right? And so here in this paper, the idea of nationalism in Islam is being dealt with, right? It's being dealt with. So in the intro, he begins with the idea that the Western discourse of modernity, that there's several different relationships or ideas between nationalism and religion, and that's very true. That's very true. Just like secularism is the same type of concept, right? But that's a different issue. We don't want to deal with that 100% right now. But the idea is that we can't just assume that we automatically know what is being said. Because when we talk about nationalism and religion, when we look at Nazi Germany, Nazi Germany was in the modality where the, especially when you look at Hegel, right there, and there's a book that's written by Kharam Murad. It talks about the dynamics of the Islamic movement, where he attempts to summarize Maulana Maududi's teachings on some political aspects. But one of the things that Maulana Maududi did very well, which was lost to a lot of people when they took kind of like a Salafi turn or they took a different type of turn, like for instance, they became Sufis or others, is to be in touch. Well, what is the political thought of the day? So one of the things that Maulana Maududi was doing in Khurram Murad, I think probably Khurram Murad probably explains it more, at least in English, explains the concepts a little more clear. One of the things that they noted is that Hegel made worship of the state became everything, and then later on we begin to see those ideas when people talk about the far, far left, that it becomes almost like the right itself when you start talking about some of the iterations of communism, how it became like the worship of the state. But the same thing with some forms of nationalism, that people don't necessarily like to associate nationalism and communism, but it became the worship of the state. But in the case of Hegel, Hegel was an interesting reality because he preceded the rise of Hitler. And when Hitler came to power, the state religion was the religion that people were bound to follow, and there was a removal of any other form of religion, and the state itself became an object of worship. And that's why you find in some of the Islamic movements there was such a focus on the whole dynamic of power. The part that was missing from that is that Hegel was also the one that separated Africa from Egypt or Egypt from Africa. And he was also the one that began to talk about or laid down some of the philosophical foundations of modern white supremacy. So when Malcolm and others like that start talking about nationalism, they have their own meaning of that. They have their own meaning of that. And there's definitely Oba Tashaka makes the argument that Malcolm stayed firm from the beginning to the end on the same program, although he modified his understanding of Islam. But Oba, he makes the argument that Malcolm, he began to expand out. He was more than just a nationalist. He was an internationalist, but he believed in land and liberation for people of African descent, specifically those in the Americas. The question, and this is not dealt with here, but I'm just kind of using this as a base to run off in the reflection. Is that bad in Islam? In recent times, that has become a point of debate, but the argument is not taken up properly in the cybersphere. Sometimes people are confusing cultural nationalism for a program of liberation, right? And they're confusing certain things. Like the religion can come in and it can modify culture. Okay, you may have some of us that agree that the hadith that prohibits certain instruments is sound in terms of music, some that don't. So we're going to have different positions on music. But are we going to limit culture just to music? You know what I'm saying? Or is culture much bigger than that? That was the whole point of bringing Amilcar Cabral into our circle, so we can start to think about that type of stuff. There also, what's important is to be able to separate religion from culture. So when people bring certain practices, is it religion or is it Islam? What is the space that we contribute to? Like all of those questions have to be brought to the fore. So there's different understandings on the relationship between nationalism and religion. And for some of in the Islamic movement, the religion served as the basis of some sort of nationalism. And you see that especially in Sayyid Qutb. Sayyid Qutb He said that the identity of the Muslim, the identity uh, of a person is being Muslim. And the nationhood of the person is being part of the Ummah. And ironically, within the Salafi da'wah, sometimes, and I've brought this up to some brothers, although it was not necessarily received well, that their idea is not necessarily so Salafi as they think because of the idea of we're just Muslim and that's it. Not all Salafis have that orientation. But I said that that's an idea that's more akin to or more similar to Sayyid Qutb than it is towards the practice of the companions. What we see Islam do when the Quran is revealed is it gradually modifies the culture of the people that were first addressed by the Quran. Not everything is dismissed in the culture of those people. See what I'm saying? So when does the argument of culture become so prominent and become a point of conflict? When there are ideas and practices in the culture and in the community overall, in the nation, that violate Islamic teachings in terms of creed and practice, the issue of bid'ah. But also, if you look at the story of Ibrahim alayhi salatu wasalam, Ibrahim was in a situation where the national culture was shirk. His father was a practitioner of shirk. The He was not only a practitioner of shirk, he was a supporter of shirk. He was an idol maker. Whether you consider it to be his father, his uncle, is somewhat irrelevant here. But that person in his life, that significant person in his life, was considered to participate in the system of shirk in that way. The national religion, same thing, the state religion. So Ibrahim leaves from that environment in which the whole nation is embroiled in it. It's a whole system embroiled in it. It's a whole cultural reality. It leaves and goes to another geographical place so that he can have religious freedom. So even when we look in the lives of the prophets, we see this issue come up. When we look at alayhi salam, when we look at the life of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Quraysh had its way. It was part of the opposition they imposed. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam transformed the culture. When we look at the European examples, I gave the example of Hegel and the example of the Third Reich or the Nazi Reich. You know the way that they operated at one point in time. When you look at the conquistadores, those who came from Europe to conquer in the Americas, they came in the name of the state and in religion, right? And so you had the king and the queen and all of that type of stuff. So there was a merger between nationalism, so to speak, and religion. But what changes the dynamic so that we can have more clarity is that in the later 19th century and early 20th century, nationalism is an issue based on race. Nationhood is based on ethnicity and race, not just on the general concept of community and people and so on and so forth. So it's based on the state being race centered, and that's what the Europeans practice. And religion became something that was minimal. And so then that becomes part of the argument why some people had issues with religion and nationalism. Here he says, secondly, the rise of nationalism coincided with a decline in the hold of religion. That's in the case of the Europeans. In the case of uh, the Muslims try to utilize nationalism for national liberation and for the establishment of Islam, right? But in any case, there was a movements, and we find that's for those of you who are aware of the history. Assad, who was in the Assad Jr., who was the head of Syria, also Gaddafi, also the PLO, and even Nasser, who to some extent Malcolm had some relations with him, but those were Arab nationalists that were Marxists, especially in the case of Assad, that they had in the case of Gaddafi, they had their own orientation. At times, they were Arab secularists in the most materialistic of ways, but they utilized religion like a pawn on the chessboard, right? So you have that type of dynamic in the Muslim world. And so that's why sometimes these ideas are not received well, just like the way that we dealt with communism and Marxism in Latin America was not like it was dealt with in other places. It wasn't, antagonistic toward the religion. And we find that a lot of our imams earlier on, they came from that type of background, right? And that's what opened them up to Islam. But when you start looking at Marxism in Albania and in other parts of the Muslim world, it destroyed religion. That's why we say these concepts have to be properly understood. They mean different things, and so on and so forth. So then another phase came in. The first phase was nationalism and religion are different and contradictory, right? In this view, nationalism is assumed to be secular and inherently contradictory to religion. Second view, the rise of nationalism coincided with the decline of the hold of religion. Religions lost power when confronted with the consciousness of common nationality. Thirdly, nationalism took the place of religion as the principle which governs all social and intellectual life. Now, mind you, this is in the European context. This is not universal. This is in the European context. The Europeans were constantly fighting themselves. There was no concept of European. It was tribal. Every tribe was trying to dominate the other tribe, right? And they didn't gain a sense of working unity really towards the appearance of the United States, in which they came in and through white nationalism, they were able to leave off the differences that they fought over in Europe and merge into some sort of common identity, right? And then now we find that reemerge again because there's some sort of breakdown and they have an issue with this idea of multiculturalism, which they invented the concept. But the idea is to get an understanding of the different stages of nationalism. Lastly, the imagined communities of nations do not replace religious communities, although religious communities are in decline. The question can be asked how Muslim intellectuals have viewed Western ideas and nationalism in particular. In fact, the question of the relationship between nationalism and Islam has historically revealed dynamic discourses, but it seems to have gained little attention. That was uh, in the introduction. I'm going to push forward ahead. I'm not going to hit all the details. But he talks about the rise of nationalism in the Muslim world. Before anything else, it is necessary to define what nationalism means. How it was translated uh, is the idea of qawm, which qawm comes up in the Quran, right? So they found the Quranic concept, a concept which means to be people centered, my people. Qawm in the Quran, the Anbiya or the prophets bring it up. And sometimes you find them say, Ya qawmi, oh my people. So nationalism here is translated as qawmiya, or the feeling in an idea or a movement being part of or for the sake of a nation. And that kind of to me is a little weird. And that's why Marsafi uh he brings up the idea of these terms needing to be clarified because nation doesn't necessarily only mean the people, right? The idea of ummah comes up in that regard more so, right? But in some ways, the idea of nationalism that is being brought up under the concept of Qawmiya, it, it is that feeling of tribal identity that we belong to a larger people, so to speak. But nationhood is always tied to land is not just tied to a feeling, right? And so, but here, this is what Dr. Obatashaka tries to make the argument of that within the context of the black community, because there is no land claim for a lot of people. Not to say that there's some don't make that claim, but that's why there has to be some sort of distinctiveness, uh, that's brought to the fore. Right? Related to this is patriotism. And so here he's bringing up the issue of Wataniya. So he's defining nationalism as Qawmi, and we mentioned the problem with that already. And patriotism as Wataniya, like commitment to the country, right? The idea of fatherland. And ironically, the idea of Watan and all of that, uh, fatherland, you find that a lot of the Germans and the other Europeans were pushing that, and the Muslims got caught up into that as well, because that became the way to organize the society. So other things that come up is that nationalism is love of a nation, while patriotism is love of a fatherland. Yet many Muslims often use these terms interchangeably. As for the attachment of the religious and the secular to nationalism, some scholars have used the two terms to indicate significant difference between them. Religious nationalism refers to a nationalism which is strongly or weakly, implicitly or explicitly related to the deen, right? And I mentioned the case of Sayyid Qutb, that, our identity is Muslim and our nationhood is being part of the Ummah. That was his concept. Meanwhile, secular nationalism means that a national feeling is purely free from something religious, divine, or transcendent. Right? I wouldn't even say purely free, but in secular nationalism, there may be a combination between you're Christian, you're Muslim, and you're pledging allegiance to the flag. And so that there, in some nations, they allow for multiple religions to have some sort of commitment to the land. But those are discussions that can be had. Originally, nationalism first developed in Western Europe, bringing about the reorganization of Europe in the 19th and 20th centuries. In the first half of the 19th century, it was associated with democracy, liberalism, with his greatest prophet being Giuseppe Mazzini. He was the one that pushed the idea, right? In the later 19th century, it was linked to aggressive, intolerant forms identified with military and trade rivalries, national expansion, and imperialism. In the 20th century, it has been an essential element in fascism and other totalitarianism. An association of nationalism and nation state began to appear at Napoleon's attempt in Europe. And when we go back and we see these concepts, we begin to have some sort of understanding of why there's opposition, right? Why it is that there's opposition. The Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, as early as that, was regarded by many scholars to signal the consolidation of the modern nation state. And that's what we're in now. We're in a battle for the nation state because it's on decline. And the nation state usually meant that there's a constitution and there is an ethnic identity, uh, that constitution serves. So now with the battles of immigration and with this idea of whiteness that's coming back with this administration that we have in this country, there is an indication that the nation state is in crisis. Now the problem is that the U.S. itself has not been a nation state in the real sense for a long time because it's been an imperial order. The U.S. is an imperial order. It's an empire. But for the average person, there was this thought of what? There was this thought that the U.S. is just a nation state. And so with the Trump administration, you find this idea of the nation state trying to come back, but the world it's been set on a different uh, set of relationships in terms of communities having to share with each other and so on and so on. So there's a lot to be said in that regard, and that's really the realm of political science with regard to globalism and the global economy in the whole idea of international law and what that means. But we see that in that regard, pulling out of NATO, not really dealing with the UN, sidelining international law, that the US is in a weird state. And at the same time, it can't sustain itself, right? It can't sustain itself. And then now at the same time, they're trying to reassert Christianity as the national religion, right? And there's so much of a movement coming from politicians that's anti-Islam, and there's a general tendency for people to want this U.S. This country to only speak English, to only uh, be white, and or everyone else subjugated somehow. So those are realities that, whether we think are relevant or not, are relevant. The realities of what does all of this mean, nation state and nationalism, so on and so forth. In the Muslim countries, nationalism came to develop through the different but related process of foreign occupation and political modernization. The fall of the Khilafah, Napoleon, uh, he conquered Egypt. Napoleon actually rode his horse into Al-Azhar al-Sharif, into the masjid. And ironically, at the same time that Napoleon was doing that, what else was happening? That's why historical model has to be on point, and we have to be able to think on our own and think out of the box, because connecting what's going on at one point in time to another point in time, and connecting what's going on in one geography to another geography is not the way that history is done, and it's not done like that intentionally. Because then we can grasp an understanding of exactly what is the case. But when Napoleon was conquering Egypt, right, in that late 1700, 1798, when he was riding his horse into the masjid, think about this, because as Muslims, we don't talk, even this is brought up that is not really highlighted. Sayyid Hussein Nasser, he says, oh, at that time when Napoleon went in, there was no cultural shock to the Muslims. They were okay with themselves, right? And eventually, to be honest with you, that way of approaching things, although he ends up becoming, Sayyid Hussein Nasser becomes very anti-modernist in his thinking. It stops the Muslims from really thinking about their reality. Now, what was going on at this time period is that the Haitian Revolution kicked off. So while Napoleon was in one part of the world trying to conquer as an individual, right? In another part of the world, the same values that they claimed that they were bringing to the people, democracy and liberty and brotherhood and all of this, the Haitians were launching the first universal Black revolution for land and freedom. And it was a transformation also of the identity of people, because the idea for them for Black no longer became a racial designator. It was no longer like a color issue. It became those who were part of the struggle. And during the same time, a little later, the British came and they occupied Egypt, 1882. And then by the time 1924 hit, the Ottoman Empire completely collapsed. Now, what I was trying to say was that while the Haitians are taking consciousness of what is going on, and this is why the Oba Tashaka's framework is important, although it remains somewhat ambiguous at times, it's still something to be worked on. When he looks at Malcolm, when he looks at Ella Baker, when he looks at Amilcar Cabral, the stages of consciousness is because of this reality. The Muslims haven't gone through those stages of consciousness. So those of us who inherit Malcolm, we're in a different level or stage. Many of the Muslims are still not even waking up to these realities of being colonized. Now, distinctly, And this is documented. The Iranians, they said we started to read Fanon and we started to read, you know, the thinkers that were coming from the Americas, and we realized that we were those people. We realized that we were those colonized people, right? And so even when you start looking at Fanon going into Algeria and stuff like that, the response towards the colonial hit on the Muslim side, it remained in many ways just the issue of we just need to get these people out of our land. That's for the most part what was the response? Oh, we need to come to some agreement with them. But there was not a lot of self-reflection, on terms of what is it that we need to do to transform ourselves, except what was coming out of certain movements, what was coming out of certain Islamic movements. But even there, the idea was just like let's focus on strengthening our Islamic identity. That was the concept. But there was never a real conversation on how can our Islamic identity transform our consciousness, right? So you found two movements, the traditional type of camp and the Salafist approach. I'm not talking about the Salafi Dawah. The Salafist approach was the idea that we need to return back to the sources so that we can understand the sources, so we can re-energize ourselves and engage in a process of revival, in a process of reform, revival of the deen and reform of ourselves. The other camp was like, we need to retreat back into tradition. Then there was a blend of all of that as well. And that's what you find in a lot of the Islamic movements. And that's why the idea of ummah becomes transformed and it becomes a political concept once again. That's why the people start trying to work out the concept of nationhood, and trying to map out liberation in that sense. They try to talk about, well, if you can have each community liberate itself, then we can agree at some point in time and have some sort of collaborative system. There was a lot of things that were proposed, but that type of consciousness system that we saw, for instance, with the Malcolm, that necessarily did not exist. You know what I'm saying, with the Muslims, and in many ways, it has hurt the Muslims because there's a somehow, some way, there's the internalization of the love of the oppressor still there, right? And so no matter, and we see that. I mean, that's very obvious in what's going on in today's time. I don't want to get into too much into that. So in its early stages, nationalism in the Muslim world received the support of European powers because eventually that contributed to the fall of the Ottoman Empire. But then look at the Muslim response in today's time. The Muslim response is that the ones who collapsed the Ottoman Empire were the Saudis, were the Salafis. They were. It's such a religious based sectarian type of orientation. There's not an analysis on how it was that certain religious practices in the Ottoman Empire led to the decline of industry, or how it was that the non-Muslims took from Al-Andalus and Timbuktu and that dual uh, knowledge base, and how it was that they borrowed from them, and how it was that they were able to launch uh, a knowledge revolution. We're not looking at the gaps that we had on all of those fronts. Automatically, people put it uh, to kind of like they gave the causes of Muslim decline. Sometimes it was like that we were not following the Sunnah, or sometimes it was that you know we took on another culture, this that. but there was not a holistic understanding overall on what were the areas that led to Muslim decline, right? And so I want to go to the Muslim responses and then close it out. Some of the Muslim responses. Muslim intellectuals who generally gained better education domestically or abroad were inclined to respond in the above general environment as well as their specific milieu. The reality is that the Muslims that were educated abroad, initially they became the very force for the colonial powers, right? They became the first tier because they were trained and educated in that mindset. But after some time, those who were educated abroad, they fell into a contradiction with themselves. And so they were neither of that world and neither of the Muslim world. So that required of them to engage in some sort of soul search. And so that's where you began to see some transformations, that were taking place. Like somebody like Maududi, he had an Islamic education, but he was trained in Western thinking and so on and so forth. And he came back and he had the ability to speak to all of those masses that were educated in the West that were no longer really responding to the Molanas. And he was able to organize a movement and he was able to uh, stave off the Marxist assault on Pakistan. All the other efforts that they were supposed to be making to revive the deen kind of went to the wayside because they had to put all of their energy in making sure that Marxism didn't completely overtake the Muslims. But it was that educated, Western educated group that began to see that something had to be done, and they tried to come up with some sort of solution. And they always, for the most part, fell out of favor with the scholars who necessarily, were not, their pushback was limited, right? Because it was a new type of assault. So their pushback was sometimes to call for armed struggle, but intellectually and so on and so forth, there were some real challenges that were there because there was a decline. And most of what the Muslims were being overtaken was in when they were studying the sciences, right? And so that was a big issue. So in any event, Muslim intellectuals who generally gain better education domestically or abroad were inclined to respond in the above general environment as well in their specific milieu. Ideological, political, cultural, and religious attitudes emerged and developed throughout the Muslim communities in their specific context. Language probably represented the first most explicit direct impact of the encounter between Islam and the West or Europe. And that's where the idea of the eight terms comes in at. And I mentioned this, the idea of what does it mean to be an ummah? What does nationalism mean? They had the idea of race, the idea of citizenship, all of those concepts which were borrowed from the West, now they had to be dealt with within in here the context that's given is Europe. So now here, Sheikh al-Marsafi, Sheikh Hussein al-Marsafi from Al-Azhar, he wrote his book Risalat al-Kalim al-Thaman, or the treatise on the eight words, and he attempted to explain the meanings of those words which circulated as reformist vocabulary of the period, such as watan, fatherhood, ummah, nation, hukuma. See how the change took place. He's a little more accurate. Adl when it comes to justice, zulum and justice, siyasa, politics, tarbiyah, education, hurriya, freedom. So he examined these. Now, some of the scholars, they took this model of examining language and they found about 500 words later on that were being used specifically in the Arabic language that took on different meanings, other than the meanings that they had in their origins, because these words were basically colonized, right? These words were basically colonized. And so when you start thinking about, for instance, Miseducation of the Negro by Carter Woodson, Carter Woodson is like the whole institution of education is colonized. So we need to break and create our own institutions. Malcolm was like the way that we look at language, the way that we read history, the way that we understand identity, the way that we're being uh, portrayed in the media, all of that is an indication of being alienated from the self, right? So this is where we can find some overlaps in terms of what's going on in the Muslim world and find a bridge to what was going on over there. But still, they struggled a lot. But Egypt was probably one of the more successful places, contrary to what people may like to say or not, in dealing with these issues because they started dealing with them head on intellectually, right? And they still suffer from this stuff, but they were able to deal with some of these problems, and they didn't go as far as, like, for instance, what we saw in Tunis, or what we saw in other places, like Turkey, where they completely abandoned Islam in the public sphere. Egypt may have gone through some issues, but it still was holding on to Islam. And part of that was because there was a knowledge base, right? And so the resistance here at first is being waged at the level of language and ideas. So the concept of the European nation has clearly affected the Islamic concept of ummah and the Arabic language of watan, of jins. The ummah, according to Al-Marasafi, is a collectivity of people who are brought together by unifying fact, this being on the basis of investigation, language, locality, or religion. To Al-Marasafi, the bond of language was the stronger one, for it enabled people to express the same ideas and thus to reach their communal goals. So we find that in the Muslim world, they were engaging in some sort of national struggle. Even Saudi itself, where you find this tension, the House of Saud, they united with uh, Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdul Wahab, and they formed what is now Saudi Arabia, right? Uh, as a nation, as a nation. And so you find, for instance, in the Arabic speaking world, the difference is they say Arab Islam or Arab Muslim. That's because there began to be some idea of how can we create a nation. And the ones who injected a lot of this Arab nationalism, it was not the Muslims, it was the Arab Christians. The Arab Christians created a space for themselves as the Muslim power began to break down, they created a space for themselves. But the Muslims, they tried to figure out, specifically in places like Egypt, how can we have identity and how can we wage this struggle of liberation? And so the focus on language became one of those issues. Focus on language. That's how Arabic was kind of put to the front. And so there was this whole push for the Arabic language. So we'll stop there. So language became one of the front lines in which the whole concept of liberation struggle comes in. But then the question comes up, what happens when every group is just focused on language? Is it going to be that community is going to advance itself, or is that community is going to be exclusive? And so, like, for instance, in this country, there's this idea of emphasis on English. But when you start looking at teaching English and teaching grammar, it's very weak. So that concept of pushing English doesn't have anything really to do with elevating the cultural level. It has to do with identity only, right? And so that's something that we have to think about. Because, like, when you compare in Malcolm's time, when you look at all of those leaders, specifically from the Black community, whatever ideological strand that they had, or whatever orientation that they had politically, they were solid. There's actually a video in which Malcolm is with about seven other leaders, I think it is, maybe five other leaders, and they all of them have linguistic prowess. All of them have mastery of the English language. There's no comparison to today's time versus that time because the educational standard was different, right? The educational standard was different. So there's no doubt that language uh, plays a big role in liberation, dominating it, controlling it, but also in shaping it. And so, in realizing that there's certain concepts that come into the language that they constrain the mind. And so, first stage of liberation in many cases is language. Paulo Freire kind of brings that up as well in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, that if a people does not have some sort of mastery of language, then they begin to lose the ability to communicate themselves effectively. So the more that there is, a mastery of language at the levels that we talked about of elevating our thinking, of being able to expand, of being able to see words for what they are. And Malcolm went through that experience of how it is that words are used to control. Then we can begin part of the liberation process. But we'll stop there, and I'll upload the paper so people can look at it while people are still getting uh, their their books, if they're going to do that, inshallah, and they have something to refer to, and I'll upload the video, inshallah. If there's any comments or remarks, you can shoot them now.